we're going to be talking about clean air really matters. So, right from the beginning, we've really been lobbying aerosol transmission of COVID-19. And there's been a lot of webinars that we provided, and I've lost count, but quite a few webinars ago, we counted that there was over 50 guest speakers that have presented. So today we're going to talk about going back to basics discussion on ways to improve indoor air quality for health. So they're the kind of operative words: indoor air quality for health. We're not just talking about COVID; we're just talking about healthy air. And we also we want to prevent transmission of SARS COV-2 and other viruses, but we just want healthy indoor air. And somebody was kind of talking the other day about, we're breathing in we're breathing in what other people breathe out. And there was an analogy that I came across. It's a bit like, taking a drink out of a cup, putting that water back in the cup, and then passing that cup to somebody else and getting them to drink the water you've just put in your mouth. So right back in July the 7th, Alex Farquhar actually and Kimberly actually opened this webinar, and it was hosted by Dr. Raymond Tellier, and we really wanted to kind of talk about the science of that time, and we really wanted to have a kind of a debate or discussion around droplets and aerosols. So Lindsay Marr opened, followed by John Connolly and Don Milton. So that webinar is recorded on the OccCoW website. Provided a link to that site. Moving to March 4th, 2022, we had Margolzata Gasperowicz, Gossier, as she prefers to be known, or she's known, who's a developmental biologist at the University of Calgary, and she's a founder of a number of these different organizations here, and she's also a member of the World Health Network, provided this kind of interesting risk algorithm, and to reduce the probability of getting infected, it's really important that we have good indoor air quality. And this is also what Gossier presented. This was back some time ago now, but we really don't know what the future holds, and we really need to be proactive and preventative. Something that's just been released is the Lancet Commission article on lessons for the future from the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's a number of items listed here. And one of them I think that's very important is costly delays in acknowledging the crucial airborne exposure pathway of SARS CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and in implementing appropriate measures at national and global levels to slow the spread of the virus. And I suggest, if people look at this article, it's getting a lot of airplay at the moment. There was recently a workshop, or two workshops, held by the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. First one was Indoor Management of Air Pathogens, Lessons, Practices and Innovations. And then the second workshop, they actually haven't got the YouTube video there yet, but it's Indoor Air Management of Airborne Pathogens Back to School. So we're really trying to leverage from, the expertise from these workshops just to share knowledge moving forward. And when I actually attended the last webinar, there's a woman from the UK, Professor Catherine Noakes, that shared this YouTube link, and it's a very good visual about how the virus spreads and what can be done to reduce exposure, including opening windows. And I suggest that people actually have a look at this video and share it. I'll provide the hyperlink in the chat box, once I finish speaking. So really, what can we do? COVID-19 is not mild. We know we can get reinfected. It gets worse. Our health deteriorates. Herd immunity is a myth. Think about long COVID. And this is just something that P.Eng tweeted. Unlike flu, SARS COV-2 gets into the blood, infects cells throughout the whole body. It's also it's a clotting disease with strokes and heart problems. Imagining COVID is like the flu, is cutting thousands of lives short. It's time to wake up. I've just provided the hyperlink to the actual the conversation from Australia. We can measure CO2. I do have a CO2 monitor, as has a lot of other people that do this kind of work, just for our own peace of mind. There's also Kashif Prasada, Dr. Kashif Prasada has provided an online app that I'll go to in a minute, where you can actually post your readings, and it just raises awareness about, the hotspots where high CO2 levels are. Ask questions about ventilation wherever you are, your workplace, or even in a coffee shop or restaurant. Just start thinking about the ventilation, and that's where measuring CO2 is useful too. And the webinar that I just attended, that I was talking about, one of the actual presenters talked about, can we limit capacity? To look at the right kind of ventilation for a certain number of people. If we have fewer people, then the risk of getting infected is less. And I've just provided a couple of hyperlinks there to information that you can go, where you can get information to put in air purifiers. And then up your mask game, shoot for respirators. They're readily available. And I just provided a hyperlink to the Aerosol Transmission Coalition, where you can actually see videos on MASc 1, 2, and 3. So MASc 1 was more provided for the public. And, just going back to CO2, it gives you an indication. It's a talking point. You can look and see where the air's getting filtered. But ideally, you want to provide much more fresh air first. And then if it's impossible, then think about filters. And, the ventilation assessment criteria, the calculator, there's a chart there that talks about what we're aiming for. So ultimately, we're aiming for higher level of ventilation, greater than 6 air changes per hour, or equal to or greater than 6 air changes per hour to 12 air changes per hour. This is the app that I was talking about from Kashif. It's quite intuitive. There is a tutorial. So if you take a measurement, you can actually post this measurement on this map, this world map, and it also asks you if there's a MASc policy in place as well. So hopefully this will bring more attention to those places where the carbon dioxide is suboptimal. I think we also need to think about innovation, newer and or well-established technologies. This is something that I just came across. It's actually an Irish-approved respirator, but you can see that there's a clear piece here where you can see this woman's mouth. So, thinking about school situations, that might be useful. And also, this is just something that I've pulled off the web about putting in supplemental air disinfection using upper UV inactivation. So this is getting a lot of attention at the moment. It's proven technology. It's been shown to work against TB. There's just an article there that talks about being equivalent to 24 air changes per hour. And also there's a lot of attention now on far UVC at a wavelength around 222 nanometers. I think there's still some work to go there too, but all of those technologies are there. But definitely the standard upper UV GUV is shown to work. Now I just want to introduce you all to Joey Fox. I just think about where we are at the moment, and there's people that we've had speak in our webinar series, like David Fissman, for example. You know, true leaders that see there's something that needs to be done and they want to fill gaps. So just want to, you know, put Joey in the same bracket, so to speak. He's a professional engineer, has a master's in science, and he's reviewing indoor air quality basics along with lots of practical ideas and strategies that you can apply to improve ventilation and health in workplaces large and small, including your home. Like I said, he's a professional engineer with over 10 years in the heating, ventilation and air conditioning industry, specializing in schools. And, you know, really, he's currently the chair of the Indoor Air Quality Advisory Committee for the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. And I just want to thank Joey again for offering to talk to us. And this is going to be a lot more interactive. So Joey's provided some slides, but hopefully we can get into a conversation after Joey's presented, and then we'll take, and there'll be Q&As. Thanks. Over to you, Joey.
So thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen. I believe this is the one. Share. So can everyone see my screen? Oops. Slideshow. Can you see?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So thanks for the intro. I watched that seminar with Dr. Marr and lots of other people, the one that she organized, and I found it was very helpful, especially for someone like me or facility managers or people making decisions about what to implement and how to improve indoor air quality. But the question is, people who, you know, teachers in a classroom or employees in an office, they don't have control over what type of filters to put in an air handling unit, or what percentage to set the outdoor air to control how much outdoor air is coming in. So what can individuals do? When you go into a space or you have a space where you're constantly in, what can you do yourself in order to try to improve the air quality there? So I'm going to outline 5 different steps that you can take to try to ensure that the air quality is pretty much as good as you can get it. So just quickly, I'll go into more detail on all of these, but 1, ensure your thermostat is set properly, monitor the carbon dioxide levels, monitor the airflow in the HVAC system that supplies air to your space, open windows and use a HEPA filter. So we'll go through them one by one, just to give you an idea of all the different things you can do. So we'll start with your thermostat. Now, a lot of buildings, especially I know for schools and bigger places, what I do is building automation systems. So you have controllers that control all the different equipment, and it's all connected to a central computer. And from that computer, someone could pretty much control the whole building and the entire HVAC system. HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So it's what's responsible for making you comfortable from a temperature perspective and also healthy from a ventilation perspective. So it's really one person can control the whole building and see how the whole building is done. That's what happens in a lot of places. Some places you have individual controls in every single zone, and that usually comes in the form of a thermostat. So I know some places you have control over the thermostat where you are. So you want to make sure it's operating properly. Now, one of the most common problems is the fan is set to auto mode. And you could see this picture of this Honeywell thermostat where it is actually in auto mode. Now, what happens in auto mode is the air handling unit or the rooftop unit, whatever supplying air, only turns on if the space is too hot or too cold. So if the space is fine, it's just going to turn off. But that's not how ventilation works. You're not supposed to just shut off ventilation if you're comfortable. You're supposed to have it going on all the time. So when a space is occupied during the day, the fan should always be set to on. When you go home for the night, you could put it back in auto, so it does, because you don't need to ventilate empty spaces, but fan should always be set to on. Now you could also always, you know, listen, see what's happening with the HVAC equipment. We'll go into more details on how you could actually monitor the flow and monitor the carbon dioxide. But get to know the HVAC equipment and make sure the thermostat is set properly. Now, this happened, the picture on the right, it's a little hard to see. I believe this was Berkeley schools in California. They installed these fancy unit ventilators, and again, there were thermostats in the zone, and these unit ventilators were actually much more complicated and much more advanced than just a simple unit. And they have a recirculation mode there. There's a little circle there that recirculates the air. It minimizes the amount of outdoor air that's being brought in. So again, if you have control over the unit that supplies your space, I would look at the manual and see how you can maximize the amount of outdoor air being brought in. So it could have been just a setting to turn off recirculation mode and you would get a lot more outdoor air and a cleaner air in your space. So that's the first thing to do. If there are controls in your space, you should try to maximize them to give yourself as much outdoor air as possible. The next thing you can do is monitor the carbon dioxide. So you need to be careful how to use it. A lot of people, I think, might be using it in the wrong way. It's a helpful tool. It has its limitations. So we'll go through a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of CO2 and how you can use it. So first, before we start, make sure if you get a carbon dioxide monitor, it should have a non-dispersive infrared sensor, so NDIR. There are lots of junk sensors out there, cheap ones, and they do not work as well. They're inaccurate and you can't rely on them. So the NDIR ones tend to be a little more expensive. There are actually some reasonable ones now, ones for like $70 even. So now with much more interest in using carbon dioxide monitoring, I believe the prices are starting to go down, but make sure you're getting a good quality one because there's still a lot of inaccurate ones on the market. So what does carbon dioxide tell you? So outdoors, carbon dioxide is measured in parts per million. So out of 1 million molecules of dry air, how many are carbon dioxide molecules? Outdoors, it's 400 or 420 parts per million. And what you breathe out is around 40,000 to 50,000 parts per million. So as you have less outdoor air in the space and more air that's already been through people's lungs and been rebreathed out, the carbon dioxide levels go up. So you can estimate how much air is backwash, how much air you're rebreathing based on the carbon dioxide levels. So this was a table that was given by David Elfstrom, and 800 parts per million is 1%, 1,200 parts per million is 2%, and it goes up. So the higher the CO2 levels, the more air you are sharing and rebreathing. And since COVID spreads and other airborne diseases spread by just breathing in the same air that other people breathed out, this is a good gauge in many ways for the risk of a space, but it's not perfect. You could see next to it, it's one of the NDIR sensors, the CO2 click. I got this from, I believe, Dr. James Smith's off Twitter. He's been going around, and a lot of people have been going around and checking CO2 places to let the CO2 in different places to let you know how good the air is. What CO2 measures from more of an engineering perspective is you can predict how much outdoor air is being supplied to a space. You can calculate it, and that could be very useful when it comes to ensuring a space is complying with standards. So I'll go through that. Now here's the technical details of really what CO2 is. So CO2 is generated by people, and we could predict, and these tables are from a publication by Andrew Pursley in 2017, where he measured how quickly people are generating CO2. So first you have to know what type of activities they're doing, and based on the activities, you could predict their metabolic rate, and it's metabolic rate relative to when you're lying down. So if you look at the right table here, for example, I'll go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the bottom. Sleeping, okay, sleeping, then you're pretty close to lying down or even a little less. Or if you go to the second one from the bottom, so that's walking less than 2 miles per hour, your metabolic rate, so it's measured in the amount of energy you're putting out per square centimeter of your skin, I believe. It's twice as much than lying down. So when you're walking at a slow pace, you're burning twice as much energy as when you're lying down. Now, depending on who you are, so what your sex is, male or female, your age, and the activity level, if you have those 3 pieces of information, you could predict how much carbon dioxide you will be exhaling. And then if you look at the space, how many people are there, you just multiply by the amount of people, and you could predict what the CO2 levels should be, how much is being generated. Now, you also have to be cautious that there are other sources of CO2. So for example, if you're burning candles there, they give off carbon dioxide. If there are pets there, they would give off carbon dioxide. Depending on the pathogen, a lot of them can't transmit between animals and humans. So you could have higher CO2 levels because of that. but not necessarily be at higher risk. If you have, let's say, a church where they're burning tons of candles and CO2 levels are through the roof, but there aren't that many people there, you might just be measuring the CO2 from the candles. You're not really measuring it from people. So that doesn't indicate poor ventilation, and it doesn't indicate high risk. So you have to understand the limitations of this. Now, that's how CO2 can increase. All the people and other sources of combustion can increase CO2 levels. CO2 is removed either by ventilation. So when you bring in outdoor air at lower CO2 levels, you also exhaust air from the space, which is at higher CO2 levels, and it leads to a net reduction. So the higher the generation, the higher the final CO2 levels will be, the quicker the removal, it will lower the CO2 levels. Now, one more thing, there are types of equipment, there are absorption type cleaners, they use a chemical reaction to remove CO2 from the air. It's not common, it's not used that much. It's used on the International Space Station, for example. You need it in space to get rid of carbon dioxide, but that's not found in most commercial buildings. If there is something like that, then the CO2 levels, again, they don't really tell you what the rebreathed fraction is and what your risk is. Okay, so how would you use CO2? So first, it's indirectly related to COVID risk. Like we said before, in general, it predicts how much air you are rebreathing from other people. So it can be used in that way. Now, you also have to bear in mind other things like HEPA filters or using UV to inactivate viruses. They also provide just as much protection as ventilation. You really don't care where it comes from. 1 unit of clean air is 1 unit of clean air. I just saw a question. I'll get back to it in a second. So, so even if you have higher CO2, but you have HEPA filters in, let's say, upper room UV, that's going to really lower your risk when it comes to COVID. The other thing you always have to have in mind is what's the community infection rate. It makes a big deal. If there's no one infected there, the CO2 could be through the roof, and your risk is 0 because there's no one infected there. So as you have higher infection rates in the community, you're more likely to have more infected people there. So the risk still goes up, even if CO2 remains at a constant level in different places. So the question is, a place without HVAC, how can you improve the CO2 levels? So again, this CO2 gets lowered through ventilation. Now, HVAC systems are generally mechanical ventilation. So that's when you have a machine, a fan, supplying air to the space, and usually the air is filtered and it's also tempered, so it's at a comfortable temperature. The other type of ventilation is natural ventilation, which is either windows, so you can open them. Sometimes it's forced natural ventilation, but there's also what's called uncontrolled ventilation, which is infiltration. It just air leaks into the space. So really your options, if there's no HVAC system, and most buildings do have some HVAC system, but if there is none, then your options are essentially windows. That's how you could get air into the space. And I'll be going over opening windows later on. So how can you use CO2? So here's really how I think CO2 needs to be used. Because you can predict what the CO2 levels would be in the space. So for example, a classroom, you know there's going to be certain kids at different ages and a teacher at a certain age, and you could predict what type of activities they will have. Generally, it will be sitting down, writing, not high-level activities. You could predict what the CO2 levels would be if you're getting the right amount of outdoor air. So we have requirements on new buildings, what amount of outdoor air you should be getting. So given the types of space and the type of activity and the type of people there, you could predict it. So I think this is where CO2 really needs to be used, that you put them in classrooms, and in order to comply with modern standards, an elementary school should have 900 parts per million, and a high school should have 1,000 parts per million. A high school has higher levels because teenagers put out more carbon dioxide. They generate more than little kids do, but the requirements have the same ventilation rates essentially for high schools and elementary schools. So you can predict based on the people there what the CO2 levels should be. I gave a couple more examples. An office, a typical office is also 1,000 parts per million. And just as another example, a party hall, because the ventilation rates there are actually lower per person, and the density is really high, you could have a lot of people. So these standards in a party hall are actually fairly low ventilation per person, which means CO2 levels of 2,000 and up, is completely within modern guidelines. So that's why CO2 should be used in many ways to verify you're getting the proper ventilation that is required to get full protection from the spread of airborne diseases. It could be through better ventilation and having lower levels. It could also be through using filtration or using UV light. So are CO2 level at 2000 ppm safe? The answer is kind of yes. So are there long-term biological effects from having higher CO2 levels? Yes, you're less, it's been shown to be less productive, for example. So in a party hall, that's not that important. In an office and in a classroom, it would be much more important to have higher levels of productivity. The concern about a party hall with CO2 levels is if there's no other mitigation strategies in place, the risk will be high, especially with the high density. The risk of transmission will be high. But again, that could be mitigated through, whoops, I see some questions pop up for a second and then I can't get back to it. That could be mitigated through filtration or UV, so it doesn't have to be with ventilation. The question I think was what regulations of this? So for commercial spaces, it's ASHRAE 62.1. It's the requirements for indoor air quality. In commercial spaces, in residential spaces, it's ASHRAE 62.2. And in Canada for healthcare, it's CSA Z317 or something like that. I keep on missing I didn't get that question. I need to close this somehow to get the question. Give me a second. Let me stop sharing for a second to see, because I'm sure I missed a lot of questions.
One of us can just read them to you too, Joey, or we can do them at the end. It depends on how you prefer.
So the way we normally do it is we usually give a presentation and then we usually go through the chat at the end. It kind of, I don't know, it's up to you. You can go through, I can read them.
Okay, so I'll go through the presentation and I'll do all the questions at the end. So I'll tell you right now, as part of the committee I'm chairing, we're putting out a calculator that will tell you what the CO2 rate should be in all different places. Again, they have the limitations. So let's say a classroom should be 900 ppm, but if you're having an activity where the kids start get up and run around the room, or they're getting ready to go outside in the winter and they're all getting changed into their snow pants, the metabolic rate's going to go up. They're going to be breathing out, generating more carbon dioxide, and you would expect the CO2 levels to spike at that point. So these are general guidelines of what should be the constant rate. They have their limitations, but I think it's also an important thing. If you're finding in a classroom that it's chronically at 1,200 parts per million, then you're probably not getting enough ventilation. It should be looked at and see if you could improve it slightly. So we're going to be putting out a calculator. It's not ready yet. For the time being, if you search online NIST CO2 calculator, so Andrew Pursley, who did the publication before, he's also worked on this calculator, which will tell you what the CO2 levels will be in different spaces. So you could search for that and you could get an idea to comply with modern day guidelines what the CO2 levels should be. I wanted to show you just another example. I saw this posted on Twitter. Someone said this was the CO2 from my classroom, and you could see it spiking over and over again. So what's happening here? My understanding is it's very likely that the thermostat is in auto mode, that when the temperature is satisfied, the unit shuts off, and then the CO2 spikes up, and then all of a sudden it gets too hot and the cooling turns on, and the CO2 drops once the unit turns on. So you could see it bouncing up and down. Now, I just drew a red line of what the CO2 levels could look like if it wasn't in auto mode. So you could see in general, it tracks to when it's operating at its best, but all the times it turns off, it really raises the CO2 levels. Now, if this was a classroom, again, it's not fully in compliance with guidelines because it looks like it's approaching 1200, which is higher. You want it to be closer to 900. But at the same time, having it run all the time would be much better. You'd keep on average much lower CO2 levels. So making sure the system is running properly could really make a huge difference. Okay, so the first thing was the thermostat. The second thing was monitoring CO2. So now I think people really need to start getting to know how the HVAC system works. It's really health and safety of the space. If your fire alarm system was always malfunctioning and it's a safety issue and you could easily check the fire alarm system yourself, you shouldn't need to, but it might be a prudent thing to do. Now, that's actually the case with HVAC, where this is a health and safety issue, and these systems are often not functioning properly. So there are easy ways for people to actually figure out what's happening. So first to know, air is supplied through supply diffusers and it returns through return grills. So you can see on the ceiling here, usually it's on the ceiling, the square diffusers, those are the supply diffusers. And the return grills usually don't have, they're not diffusers, the air just could go through it. Now I think you could see there's little strips hanging off the supply diffusers, which is fantastic. I'll go through that as one of the methods. So just so you know what they look like, these are typical supply and returns. So there's the square diffusers, there's the round ones, the circular ones, and there's also linear diffusers. Sometimes it looks like just a slot in the ceiling or the wall and air comes out. And return grills, the first one is what you would typically find in your house, for example. And the vast majority of return grills are the egg crate shape. So, yeah.
I wonder. I may have to go back to the manufacturer when I think about this now. Yes, you're breathing.
I'm just wondering if you
did they do any confirmation testing that on your exhalation breath that it's actually filtering?
Sorry, you're asking a question. Can you repeat the question? Sorry. Hello.
Sounded like a question about masking, filtering what you exhale.
Joey, just
Okay.
while we have this pause, you're in presenter mode, or we're seeing your next slide, so it would make the slides bigger for people if you go under display settings.
I'm sharing that screen. Well, I'm sharing the wrong
It just
screen.
happened when you stop sharing and start it again.
I shared the wrong screen there. Share.
It's okay. It just makes it bigger for people if you just do that.
Let me see. Is this screen working now?
No, you're not sharing right now.
WebEx.
There you go.
Yep.
Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so now you can see the whole thing. So there's the supply and the return. So the most common return is the egg crate shape. So when you look around the space, these are what you could look for. Now, I would go around and just test to see if there's airflow coming out. The carbon dioxide will tell you how much outdoor air is coming in, but a lot of the air is recirculated. So a lot of times even the unit shuts off. So measuring even what the air is doing could also be very helpful.
It's, you know what, it's trying to figure out, for this one, for the Dantech, I feel like, okay, yeah, Dantech's a great idea, but
she's not on
know if
mute.
it should be priority right now. I feel like, so I'm sitting, I don't know if you've done the anti-racism, anti-oppression training yet. Have you done that yet?
It's T.
So we sat through, it's 2 4-hour days long. So anyways, we sat through the second set yesterday. And I was sitting there listening to something that they were talking about, and I was like, our lack of having a PAPR program is effectively.
Valerie, is there a way to mute everybody?
I don't know if it's, it's.
And yeah, you could mute all, or you can mute.
It's not limiting it's effectively impacting people who have.
Mute all, you have to turn Joey back on.
Right.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Joey.
Great, thanks.
Okay, okay, great. So I'll continue. So a lot of times you can see these supply diffusers, and I was in a doctor's office and they attached just a paper towel to the supply diffuser and you could see it flapping. And when I was there, actually, I could see it was barely moving. So I knew there was a problem with the ventilation. It was a really bad system they had there. The middle picture here, this is what a unit ventilator looks like. So it's a unit that's pressed up against the wall. There's actually a cut in the wall behind it, and it pulls in outdoor air from there, and it also pulls in air from the front, from the room, and it mixes them and supplies air that way. Now, I've been in rooms where this unit was off, and it's actually been off for years, and no one thought about actually looking at it, sticking their hand to see if it's working and asking about it. So people in the space, if they would say, why is this not on? And they would complain, they could get it looked at. So this is typical neglect I've seen over years and years and years in many different places. And it's not like some specific place. This is a systemic problem everywhere. So having more awareness of this, and even just doing a check of sticking your hand on top of the unit ventilator to see if air is coming out, it's a very helpful thing that you could get places fixed. Now, this was actually a picture from an article about what they did in New York. People were making fun of them for doing this, but it's a stick with a tissue or piece of toilet paper and tape. I did it myself, and you could see a nice picture if you don't know what a stick with toilet paper looks like. But you walk around and you honestly hold this up to diffusers, and in 2 seconds, you could see if it's on or not. And it's actually a really helpful tool. People were making fun of the New York School Board for doing this, but I think it was a fantastic idea. It's cheap, it's simple, it's not that complicated, anyone could do it. And I think it should be just a standard check people do. So you can do this, and if in public spaces, in commercial buildings, there should always be airflow. It shouldn't be cycling on and off. Sometimes the amount of air goes up and down, but there should always be air coming through. So if you're not seeing that, then there's a problem, and you should ask maintenance to investigate. So these are simple tests that everyone can do that I think can make a big difference. Okay, so now another thing that everyone could do in their space. So this is the fourth thing, is open windows. It's very simple, it's cheap. When the weather is nice, like it is today, just keep them wide open. When it starts getting cold, it becomes much more difficult.
Like OccCoW or something, and they can be talking in the background.
Oh, David's oh, I know it. I'm muted. Why is change microphone?
What did I say? Oh,
So,
God. No, I was talking about the human rights thing.
are you able to mute? Okay, you're muted. Good. So when it's cold outside, keeping the windows just cracked open, there's been kind of some.
What's wrong with this one?
I don't think it was
Gonna hang up
justified during the pandemic. Some people really compromised on comfort in order to try. Sorry. Some people were keeping windows wide open in the winter and freezing the rooms. So people need to be comfortable in the building. It's important to maintain thermal comfort, but at the same time, you want to try to get whatever ventilation is possible. So even keeping the windows cracked open can make a difference and really help the amount of fresh air in the room. Now, if the weather is really nice, you could take a fan and put it in the window. Fans do a better job at pushing air out than they do at pulling air in. They pull in from all directions and they push out more straight. So it's better to have the air exhausting. So you have the fan pushing into the window. Or another thing you could do even in a classroom is if you can open up the door, have the window open and have the fan in the door pushing air into the hallway. Usually there's always exhaust from the hallway, let's say through the bathrooms. So if you open up the window, you have the fan blowing air out into the hallway. It really pulls air right through the space, cleans it out quickly, and then the rest of the building can take care of that air and exhaust it out. So this is another way to boost what's natural ventilation on top of the mechanical ventilation you'll be getting from the HVAC system. So I'll go through now. This is the last thing you can do is HEPA filters, portable HEPA filters. So this is filtration. All the other things I was dealing with primarily are with ventilation, but this is another step you can take. It will not lower carbon dioxide levels, but it does just as good. And it's the cheapest way really we have to consistently clean the air. So when you purchase a HEPA filter, there's a lot of things you need to look out for. One is the clean air delivery rate. So this is how much air is being cleaned. You want the right rate, you have to calculate. I haven't gone through the calculations here, it's a little much. There are good calculators out there, but how much air a cleaner delivers is ultimately the most important thing. You also care about noise. just as a rough measure of what I've noticed, it really depends on the space. Quiet spaces can't handle a lot of HEPA filters running at full speed and putting out what's normal noise. If a space becomes a little more noisy, people walking around and stuff, then they can handle higher noise. And if it's a loud space, you could really blast them. So if there's lots of background noise, I find 55 decibels is generally okay. Medium noise in the space is 50 decibels. So a lot of classrooms are around medium, and a quiet space is 40 decibels. So in an office, it might be more difficult to have the medium noise depending on how noisy the office. If it's a noisy office, then definitely 50 decibels will probably be good. If it's a very quiet one, then you probably might need to do 40, and you won't be able to get as much clean air at that rate. So it's something that a lot of people need to verify. It hasn't been done very carefully. So a lot of HEPA filters that are noisier have been put in places, and what ends up happening is people just turn them down and they don't become that effective. So it's something that you need to keep an eye out for when you're choosing one. For cost, the expensive ones are generally not better. I found a lot of the really expensive ones are a waste. So the ones you could generally buy at hardware stores and get from Amazon, you need to make sure they're rated properly, but otherwise, in general, those are some of the best ones you can get when it comes to money efficiency. Now, there's a lot of bad products out there, so you need to be careful. The easiest thing you could do is just make sure it's AHAM verified. AHAM is an organization that certifies them. So if it's verified by them, then you know it's good. If they're advertising as true HEPA, medical grade HEPA, H13, then those are all good. H13 is the technical name for the HEPA filter, and true HEPA and medical grade are just advertising names. They're fine. I think there was a comment that yes, it's difficult to have high clean air delivery rate and below 40 decibels. So it's something you need to think about what's appropriate for the space. Sometimes you might need to have multiple HEPA filters spaced out. And that's actually, it's better like that, to have multiple ones spaced out as opposed to a big one in one place. So this is one of the disadvantages of HEPA filters, and it's something you need to deal with carefully. It's not easy, but you can get good HEPA filters properly sized for the space, comfortable for the space. But just picking ones off shelf, what happened in a lot of places when it used, it hasn't been done in the best way possible. There are a lot of misleading things out there. So I've seen HEPA-like and HEPA-style. It's not HEPA. If it's not verified, I would not get it. It's that simple. There's also a lot of junk out there. So there's a lot of these extra features, and they're always sold as being great. Lots of different names: photocatalytic oxidation, hydroxyl generators. Sometimes you have ozone generators, and we know ozone is dangerous. There's ionization and plasma and wave technology. All these technologies, they put compounds into the air. And do they help? They might help a little. They have been shown in some levels to inactivate viruses possibly, or improve deposition. At the same time, has it been shown to be very effective? I actually analyzed one, did the math on it, where the HEPA filter was able to filter out at 350 cubic feet per minute, and it had photocatalytic oxidation, which was as good as 5 cubic feet per minute. So it's like a HEPA filter, but 95% worse, and it can create byproducts, which are bad for you, and it's more expensive. So that's the type of evidence out there for a lot of these types of technologies. So I would just stay away from it if it has anything there. Either don't get it, or for example, the Winix one I know sold at Costco now is generally pretty good. Noise, the clean air delivery rate, and cost are all good. But it has this wave plasma, I believe, but you can turn it off. So if you're going to make sure it stays off, then I think it's fine to use. And I'll just say there's another type of way to filter the air, and that's the Corsi-Rosenthal box. It's the cheapest way we have to clean the air. This was the original one built by Jim Rosenthal. So it's putting 4 MERV 13 filters and attaching a box fan and making sure it's all duct taped and sealed. And they work really well, more effective than most HEPA filters on the market, and they're extremely cheap. I know if you look at Clean Air Crew, it's a great website, and they have lots of information on how to build them. Highly recommend. I just wanted to discuss briefly about personal HEPA filters, because a lot of people are interested in that. There are HEPA filters that are the size of like a coffee mug. How effective is it? So this is kind of my impression on the matter. If you hold it really close to your face, you'll be breathing in a high percentage of the air that is put out, but most people aren't going to be sticking it in their face all day long. It can work as a source control. So this was a paper published using CFD, fluid dynamics, to see what would the effect of it be in a restaurant. So the first picture is no personal HEPA filter, so just a small one on the table. And the plume coming out from that person's mouth just goes to the next person. Now, the second one is when you have it in between them, and essentially what they're breathing out goes straight into the intake of the HEPA filter. So it's essentially acting like a mask on your face, that anything that comes out gets filtered right away. So it can be used in that scenario, and it could be very helpful like that. Another thing I was thinking is it's better, instead of having air cleaned in one part of the space and just relying on mixing in the space, if you have many small HEPA filters spaced out, that would be ideal, because then you're really cleaning all the air in the space much better. So that's another way where these can be used. Now, some people have the impression that if you put it on your desk and put it, a meter away, and it's going to create a nice bubble of clean air around you. I don't think that perception is backed up by evidence. So I don't know if it'll be very effective, specifically used in that way. But the other ways you can use it, if you want to get it really close to your face if you need it for any reason, or use the source control, or if you have it widespread out, I think all those would be good uses for smaller HEPA filters. I'll just say one more thing. This was you mentioned far UV. I am not endorsing this. There's still a lot to learn about it, but I think this could be an option in the future. So UV comes in different wavelengths. Not all UV is the same. Far UV is, as Kevin said, it's UV at 222 nanometers. It is at a wavelength where, in general, your skin and eyes can handle a reasonable dose over the day. So you could shine it at you. It still is effective at inactivating viruses. Now, there are still limits of what's safe and what isn't. If you have it too far away from you, then it might not be that effective at inactivating viruses close to you. If you have it too close to you, you might exceed the values of how much UV you should be exposed to. So I don't know enough yet. I've been trying to find better information. This is a unit I saw a couple of days ago. It's 2-watt power, it's battery powered. So, I mean, ideally, if you could be certain that it's safe, and hopefully the data will come out soon. We'll know. I've been reaching out to experts, but you keep a certain distance away from you, and it essentially disinfects any air you'll be breathing in. So I'm not advising on using this yet. There's lots of data from the lab that it's safe, but it hasn't been used in real world applications. But hopefully this is another solution that could really be done, anywhere. It's still also expensive, so hopefully the prices will come down. But this is something we could consider for the future. So going back through the 5 different things that you could do in your space is make sure the thermostat's working well and your things is controlling properly, monitor the carbon dioxide, monitor the airflow from the space, use HEPA filters, and open windows. So those are the 5 things that pretty much everyone could do. I'll also say this is not just to protect yourself. If, let's say, you're a teacher in a classroom, you'll be protecting all the students, you'll be protecting all your coworkers in an office. So this is a way not just to help yourself, but to help everyone else. So I'll end it with that, and maybe I'll stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll start a discussion.
Thanks again, Joey, for giving us, donating your time, and for everything that you're doing, leading this group and providing advice. I just thought I'd maybe open that up with my first thought, and then I'll put it to everyone else for questions. So OccCoW, we kind of look at it differently with CO2. We have a calculator, and we also provide information that supports the calculator. ideally, we don't want to get above 600. What we say, what the OHCOW position is, that we don't want to get above 600 ppm, and definitely don't want to get above 1,000 ppm. And apart from not being exposed to virus, kids in a classroom when they're exposed to high levels of CO2, it makes them tired, and there's cognitive effects as well. And the thing is also, I'm just thinking that the thoughts about being in a party room at 2,000. If I was in a party room and my CO2 monitor went off, it was above 2,000, the first thing I'd want to do is leave. And the second thing I'd want to do is tell the management, and I'd ask them if they have filtration in place. Well, I'd say you might want to open the windows to see if we can get way lower, and then I might, put my respirator on, go back in, and take a measurement, and hopefully, go below 800 or even 600. But then if that doesn't work, what I'll say is you really need to think about filtration. Think about your HVAC system. And there's portable air cleaners that you can put in place. You can make these twisted roasters or boxes. So I think like having 2,000 for a party room, I just think it could be sending out the wrong message. But I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that. This is a conversation too.
So I'll answer that.
Yep.
What I was saying is, if you're complying with modern regulations, with modern requirements, you would end up with 2,000 parts per million, over 2,000 in a party room. So that's not what it should be in order to protect against.
Okay,
so that's what it should be to protect against COVID. And I'll give you an example. Let's say they have upper room UV there. If they have upper room UV and you have 2,000 parts per million, I would say it's probably a low risk space. You could easily have 20 to 30 air changes per hour, and upper room UV with 2,000 parts per million will be lower risk than a place with 1,200 parts per million. So when it comes to risk from COVID, and when it comes to the necessary ventilation outdoor requirements by code, those are two different things. And this is just minimum requirements by code. And I guess my point is, if you're using it to verify that a place is in compliance, that's fine. If you're using it to verify, to kind of estimate your own risk. So I'm willing to go to a party, but I only want CO2 levels at this level. Or if they have other mitigation levels in place, then that would be acceptable as well. I think that's a legitimate way for people to kind of assess their own risk. My point was to have ventilation in line with various requirements, legal requirements, you could actually have fairly high CO2 levels.
Oh, okay. So you're not condoning it. In other words, you're not agreeing with it. You're basically saying that it's if there's no controls in place, if there's no filtration, there's no upper UV, GI, then that's completely unacceptable. But if those controls are in place, then it may be acceptable. So I was kind of getting the impression that you were supporting it, but I feel that you're just saying that's what the requirements are. But the way I see it, the requirements are wrong. Do you agree with me?
The ASHRAE admits that the minimum ventilation requirements are not sufficient for protection from airborne diseases. So yes, the ASHRAE minimums, which those were, that is what the CO2 level would be in compliance with ASHRAE minimum. That is not sufficient for mitigation from airborne diseases. I will completely agree with that. And they don't have a standard for that, which is a big problem. Now, as far as mitigation though, it doesn't have to be through ventilation. Ventilation has many more benefits than the other methods, I think. Again, lowering CO2 levels, better cognitive, overall better health. There's lots of other pollutants in the air. So ventilation from a health perspective is the best. It's also the most expensive. So when it comes to mitigation and creating a safe space, you can't just use CO2, because if there's filtration or UV as well, then you can create a safe space even with high CO2 when it comes to protection from airborne diseases. So I think places should, one, protect people from airborne diseases, and two, at a minimum, comply with ventilation requirements. Now, the ventilation requirements aren't always fantastic, and that was an example of the worst you could find. The multi-use assemblies and hotels are the highest density and the lowest rate per person. So those have extremely high CO2 levels. But that's what the legal requirements are. That's not what's ideal.
Great, thanks. And please, I just want to open up because this is a really important discussion. I do, there's actually a colleague of mine, he joins this webinar quite often. It's probably 3 or 4 in the morning in Australia at the moment. His name's P.Eng. He's an experienced occupational hygienist as well. Please chime in, Peter. I always offer Peter to chime in, but anybody else that you want to chime in, because I think this is a really important conversation around CO2. Just to, you know, to clarify what good practice is. And as I said, the OHCOW requirements, we really don't want to see CO2 above 1,000, but ideally we want to be below 600 in any situation. So anybody else have any questions or thoughts on CO2? Val?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to relate, oh, sorry. A situation I ran into when we were talking early this week, that I went to the dentist office for the first time, thought of taking my AirNet with me, and it was for a cleaning, so it wasn't for an urgent, like I didn't have a toothache that I was feeling compelled to, oh gosh, I got to get this work. So the AirNet, when I went in, was like 1,200, then it was 1,300, then it was 1,400, and I was too reluctant to take off my mask and have my mask off for an hour in that environment when it was climbing. But then I also thought, oh, there's an air cleaner running in this room, so it's probably, you know, there's layers of protection. But I ended up deciding to leave and to go back another time at 8 in the morning, or 8 when there haven't been, you know, an accumulation. So I think and then yeah, it's just finding that balance, but understanding the layer of risks. And I guess when you take the risk, if you had a toothache and you needed something really done, and you could ensure that the air cleaner was near you, then you could create an environment, or like I actually put in the chat that I have been carrying a personal air cleaner with me on planes and on a bus yesterday for the first time, that I do, you know, use to add that layer of protection when you're in your sort of little cell, when you're, you know, like cocoon in transit. So I just wanted to add that perspective, I guess. And then when we talked at that time, Joey, you mentioned that there was a list about a dentist office, like different environments would have a different expected level. So I wondered if you want to comment on that. Thanks.
Sure. So this is something that hasn't been calculated yet, but we're putting it in our calculator. I had to go through all the regulations in Canada, and exactly, there was a lot of work to estimate, because you have to estimate the density of the dentist, what type of people were there, and look at the regulations. So I could tell you a dental suite in Canada for minor procedures, the density per 100 meters squared is 20 people per person, and you need how many air changes per hour? Don't have, let me just, it's not on hiding on my spreadsheet. You need, in a dental suite, 3 air changes per hour and 9 total air changes, 3 air changes from ventilation. If you add it all together, the CO2 levels in a dentist office should be 800 parts per million. It's really that simple. So that was the calculation we did, and it should be a requirement. I know there's a question about long-term care, 2,000 parts per million. What should it actually be? In a patient room by themselves, it should be closer to 550 parts per million. In a patient room with 4 people there, around 850 parts per million. So 2,000 is unacceptable. And this is a healthcare facility, right? And these are the most vulnerable people. And you're having just ridiculously low ventilation rates. So people, we need to start understanding what the ventilation rate should be. So we can't just say, you know, a lot of people have said, so as part of my committee, I've been recommended, why don't we just create a constant CO2 level everywhere? Every place should comply with 800 parts per million. And I don't think that's possible or reasonable, because places have different densities, places have different activity levels, places have different ventilation requirements. And CO2 is not the only way to protect people from COVID. So I think requiring compliance with modern ventilation requirements is reasonable, And I think requiring a certain level of protection from COVID and other airborne diseases is reasonable. But having a low, just flat CO2 level, it might be nice in specific situations, but I don't think it can be applied always. So you could see if 2,000 parts per million in long-term care is just completely unacceptable. It should be 500 to 800.
Okay, great, thanks. So I just want to say this kind of, I think it's like the terminology, a healthy debate. And I guess that's what we're trying to do here too, as well as have a conversation. And I kind of respectfully disagree with that, because I think if you look at what they're doing overseas, they are setting CO2 levels across the board, a lot of the guidance, and that's what OccCoW have done too. I think it's much, and I guess the other thing that I want to add there is, you know, I always kind of struggle with changes per hour. You know, really liters per second per person is a much better metric. But I'll just throw it over to Mark Denning now. Over to you, Mark.
Hi, thanks. Mark Denning, I'm with the World Health Network. I really enjoyed the talk. You mentioned a little bit ago that about like UVC, like the upper air UVC, which I've heard about. It seems like an exciting technology. If I understand it correctly, it's basically projecting UV light in a plane, you know, just under the ceiling, right? So it's like a kind of a sheet of light up there. And so when I thought of that, I thought like, well, that's great. So if anything goes through that, you know, if any of the particles that contain viruses go through that, they, you know, get sterilized effectively, but they have to get up there, right? So I was just curious, like I heard these like huge, like 30 effective kind of 30 air changes per hour, quote unquote, you know, that you're reducing the you know, the virus load in the air by so much. It makes me think like, yeah, but this stuff has to get up there, right? So in your experience, you know, does that, the effectiveness of that technology depend on the kind of airflow in the room? And like, you know, if you had a very stagnant room where you didn't have, for example, fans going and kind of mixing, you know, wouldn't that sort of like not necessarily be nearly as effective if you didn't have that flow? Could you comment on that? I'm just curious.
A great question and a fantastic point. So yeah, how I imagine upper room UV, I imagine an invisible barrier that separates the upper room from the lower room, and you care about the rate of airflow between the upper room and the lower room, right? That's what's really important between the disinfection zone and the breathing zone. So it definitely makes a big difference. Even running fans in the space help mix the air in the room, so you get that better. With high ceiling rooms, they've done studies, somewhere 50 to 80% improvement in upper room UV when you have a ceiling fan going. And when you start turning up the speed, it doesn't help that much. Even having it running on low really just helps take the air and mix it between the upper room disinfection zone and the lower room breathing zone. So moving air through the space is actually really important. I'm looking at a school where this could be put in, and one thing I'm thinking of, this is how I'm a few steps ahead, if you modify the way the air is being supplied. So the air is supplied to the ceiling there, but it's supplied at a high temperature, and air at a high temperature is a problem because it remains buoyant. There's a stratification and it's kind of stays up, and it's a big problem when you have air being supplied and just going straight to the return and it doesn't mix within the space. But one thing you could do is if you could keep the temperature a little bit lower, closer to the space temperature, it's easier for it to fall into the space mix. So even trying to lower the supply air temperature in order to allow the better mixing between the upper room and the lower room could really improve the use of upper room UV. So this is another consideration. And when you really scale up upper room UV, you start putting a lot of fixtures. I don't think adding more fixtures will help too much, where the limiting factor is what you said, is ensuring proper mixing between the upper room and the lower room. And I know in rooms that don't have mechanical ventilation have poor mixing, that's definitely something you consider if you're doing upper room, how you could improve the mixing between the upper and lower rooms.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mark, and for the question, and Toby. So just looking at the chat box here, you did address the question about older buildings, long-term care buildings, Joey, and levels around 2,000 and higher. And you agreed that that's probably not a safe level for that environment.
Yeah, it's really unacceptable to me. That shouldn't be allowed.
Okay.
It's a healthcare setting and it's vulnerable people, and you're putting them in such an unhealthy, unsafe environment. It's really, to me, it's despicable. It shouldn't be tolerated.
No, I agree. Terrible. And we need good standards, right? So Francois, everyone. I had to get a PR recently, and the HEPA filter in the exam room was flashing an alert that the filters needed changing. There was also a work order from 4 months for take beside it. Yikes. And I know you think about quality reservoir boxes, typically they say you want to, change the filters every 6 months, like rule of thumb. But this device obviously was flashing and nobody did anything to, they saw it flashing. It's a bit like driving a car. You see a red light flashing on your dashboard, you just ignore it. But I suppose this probably happens a lot. What do you think about that?
So ongoing maintenance is a big problem that needs to be dealt with. With ventilation and air handling unit equipment, I could tell you it's a massive issue. But we have carbon dioxide monitoring to ensure that that's working properly. So this is something we can use to test out the space. And if you know what the ventilation rates should be, and again, the types of people and the activity and the density, you could predict what the CO2 levels are and you would know if it's broken. So that's something we could really apply everywhere to make sure ventilation is working. For filtration, it's a separate issue. And it's a little more difficult on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's pretty easy. If you see that there's a light flashing, then you know you need to change the filter. So that's a good indicator. The problem with HEPA filters also is you could just shut them off and then now they're useless. They're not doing anything. So every method has its advantage and disadvantage. Ongoing maintenance and ongoing verification, it needs to be done much better. This is something that's neglected. I think people think you install it and it's just, let it go. And if no one complains, there's nothing to worry about. And it's had disastrous consequences. So we need a new way to approach how to maintain ongoing health and safety inside buildings through air quality.
Thanks, Joey. So the next question, there's a couple of questions there from Sonia. You might even want to show yourself, Sonia, and ask the questions, or I can ask them for you. It's up to you.
Please ask for me.
Okay. Okay. In office settings, how much air can be recirculated? What is the percentage of recirculated air with clean air that is allowable? That's the first question. I might read them both to you. You'll see them anyway. When we say air change per hour, we are saying clean air, correct? And not with recirculated air, correct? So just some clarification around, air changes per hour with clean air or not just part clean air. And the piece about the first question was
Out of
how much
recirculated air.
can be recirculated. So there's a couple of things there. Thanks.
So air has two purposes when you're pushing it through a building. One is primarily, I guess you could also filter it or humidify, but one is for heating and cooling, and the other one is for outdoor air, supplying outdoor air. So quite often, if you're using air to heat and cool, you need to supply more air than what is required for ventilation. So it depends on the unit and depends on the capabilities. In general, to actually reach, and again, ASHRAE requirements have different requirements based on different spaces, how big they are, and how many people. So it's not a universal thing, but often places which are underventilated. So for a typical classroom, usually you want 1 cubic foot per meter per foot squared, I believe, and 15 to 20% is outdoor air, but it really should be 35% to really get to the minimums. So a lot of times the equipment can't actually handle what the minimum should be. So what percentage is outdoor air? Usually it's 15, 20 to 30%. That's what is common. A lot of times that's not enough to reach even the minimum requirements. But the exact amount of total air depends on the heat load from the space, how big it is, the surface area, the window area, what type of materials are being used. So these are complicated, these are calculations that engineers need to do when they size how big the unit is, and then they calculate the ventilation to find out how much. So it varies from space to space, but in general, it's somewhere between 15 to 25, I'd say, % outdoor air. The question is calculating air changes per hour. So it depends what you mean. To protect against COVID, we should be using more careful language of equivalent air changes per hour, which means clean air from ventilation, filtration, or UV. Now, when it comes to recirculated air, if you are filtering it with filters that are actually effective against respiratory particles, like MERV 13 filters or better, then you can add that to the calculation of how many equivalent air changes per hour you are achieving. But otherwise, if there's no special filtration, if you're just using regular filtration, then the air changes only come from the outdoor air and not the recirculated air.
Thanks so much. That's really good to, think about our language really carefully and, maybe think about equivalent air changes per hour rather than just air changes per hour, because that way we're talking about filtered, clean air rather than unfiltered dirty air. So thanks, Joey. I just, there is another question, but we've got a little bit of time. There's been some discussion about Corsi Rosenthal boxes, and there are actually a group that I won't name that are recommending that we don't use them, and they seem to think that the filtration for a MERV 13 filter isn't good enough, and that the fomite contact it could be unacceptable. So there's kind of because of the filter on the outside. I disagree wholeheartedly with this kind of thinking, and I've made that clear. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about a Corsi Rosenthal box. I think they're a great innovation, and I think a lot of people should be using them. They're a low-cost solution. I'm just wondering if you had any other thoughts on it, like what I just said there.
So the worry was if someone touches it and then, let's say, touches their face, they could get infected that way? Yeah, there's no evidence that COVID's ever transmitted like that. There's no evidence for that, so they're making that up, right? I find people, they like using the word no evidence when there actually is evidence, but they don't like it. And they're more than happy to start worrying about things which have absolutely no evidence for. Even though I remember there was no evidence that masks work, but there is good evidence that you should wash your hands. That was the beginning of the pandemic. There was no evidence either way, and that's obvious. They just liked using the word evidence to push what they believed was right and to push against what they didn't like. So no, it's not a worry to transmission. I think there's a worry if you put your face right into the HEPA filter and into the MERV 13 filter and smear it all over your face and breathe in, you'll probably be inhaling a lot of dust, so that's bad for you. I highly recommend against doing that, but otherwise I think you'll be fine. Yeah. So there's no worry there. There's a question about electrical. It's not a worry. The circuits are made to be able to handle a fan. It's a box fan running on low, right? It's not a huge burden on the grid. Toronto District School Board put a HEPA filter in every single classroom, and they actually use ones that consume a lot of power. Guess how many electrical issues we had? Nothing, not one, not a single school. There's no evidence that this will cause problems. And we know it's been deployed. How many reports have there been of schools who've had electrical issues from HEPA filters or Corsi Rosenthal boxes? There isn't any. These have been installed in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of classrooms, and there hasn't been a single report. So this is there's a lot of excuses to do nothing, and that's what this is.
So from your perspective, do you see that some classrooms will start putting Corsi Rosenthal boxes? Like I'm kind of out of tune there, like I'm out of touch with that, but I would have thought that, kids can actually build them themselves, like for scientific, like in science classes, and there could be some discussion about are you seeing that happening at all?
Yeah, there's been tons of schools that have had builds. Now, there actually are a couple like public school boards that have done it. There's been a couple in Canada, not too many. Obviously, there's been a lot of resistance, but it definitely has happened, especially in the US. I know a few schools in Toronto that have had CR boxes put in everywhere. So it definitely happens. You need proper communication with the teachers. If it's not placed properly, if it's placed too close to them, then it might be too loud for them, and they'll just turn it off and get rid of it and no more. So you need to do this properly, make sure it's placed not like too close to them so the noise is tolerable, that it's being run in a comfortable way. So there needs to, you can't just, a lot of this equipment, it's health and safety equipment. You can't just throw it in and expect it to work perfectly. But there are tons of classrooms that have had them running, and with good outreach to teachers, they could be deployed everywhere.
Thanks, Joey. Just to add to that, you can always put 2 CR boxes in and run them on the lowest speed, or you could just run it on the lowest speed. I did provide a hyperlink to CleanAirMatters, and it does actually recommend different air purifiers. And actually, it does it by country too. I mean, it ranks them based on cost, but it does look at the CR box with different settings in it. So it's a very useful link. It's the cleanairstars.com .filters. It's just above the Clean Air Crew. So the last point I just want to, unless you want to add something to that else that just you thought, Joey, sorry.
CleanAirStars, just about CleanAirStars?
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add to what I just said.
No, no. What you said is there's a few good resources. CleanAirStars and Clean Air Crew are also really good resources when it comes to looking at HEPA filters and also generally about indoor air quality. So yeah, those are highly recommended resources.
All right. So there's a few more questions that have just come in. From Lee.
I just want to answer one from Lee. I've heard when we add standalone HEPA filters, it can create pockets of space with poor air exchange and disrupt the airflow exchange. Is that true? The answer is absolutely not. So you want the air well mixed within a space, and not having a HEPA filter could lead to areas where there's improper airflow and you could have higher pockets of respiratory aerosols and pollutants build up. So this is CDC recommendations and this is ASHRAE recommendations. There are some types of systems called stratification ventilation, displacement ventilation, where you have specially controlled airflow throughout the space. So putting in a HEPA filter and mixing the air in that case is not the best decision because the airflow is already very well controlled. 99.99% of spaces are not like that. And the air is just mixed. Like I showed you, the air comes in from the ceiling and it's extracted at the ceiling, it's supposed to mix in the space. So using a HEPA filter or even using a fan to mix the air is helpful in that situation. So it's actually the opposite. HEPA filters help mix the air in the space. And that's one reason why CR boxes are even better, because they push more air so they can mix air even better. So it's not true that there could be detrimental parts from HEPA filters. They actually improve airflow in the space.
And just to add to that, when you put in a CR box, have it so that the base of the box is facing down and the fan's blowing up. You'll get a much better dispersal that way and mixing. Peter, I was going to read your question out, but would you mind asking a question yourself, if you don't mind?
Yeah, that's all right. Standard CO2 surrogate numbers in a low, like I said in the note, in a low population with low incidence rate. To me, it's a little bit, you sort of not really addressing, a whole heap of other issues, trying to fix a low CO2 value in a low incidence environment. So we're basically just going to be running AC systems essentially when we probably don't need to be, especially at a lower or higher air changes. And I guess my point is that, like you pointed out, bad ventilation systems are out there everywhere. They should be the ones that we're worrying about, not trying to squeeze extra performance out of good systems.
So
comment.
I think what you're kind of getting at is demand control ventilation. Essentially, when you have fewer people in the space, you could reduce the ventilation levels. That has been done in the past. In general, I don't think that's a good thing to do. Even the minimum, so let's take a classroom, for example. You have a certain ventilation rate and now you have only half the kids. Should you be cutting the ventilation rate in half? So as an example, let's say you have one infected kid, they're getting a certain amount of, everyone else is getting a certain amount of protection from the ventilation. Now, if half the people leave, but the infected kid is still there, and you cut the ventilation rate in half, everyone gets half the protection now. So I don't think that the demand control ventilation can be used to reduce the ventilation when there's fewer people there. And that's also a flaw with CO2, that when there's fewer people there, you might have low CO2 levels, even though the whole ventilation rate is not that great. And you might have this false sense of security that there's another infected person there, the ventilation is really not that great overall, but because there aren't that many people, there's low CO2 generation, even though one of the people is infected. So you're running into that issue too.
That's a
Kind of address.
great comment, great discussion. There's some.
I would say, I agree. One of the important uses of carbon dioxide is to find out where the really high carbon dioxide levels are and prioritize those for improvements. Where we should know where we need to focus, where we should be spending our efforts and our energy to improve air quality.
I guess that was my point. You know, we're trying to chase the last 10% of performance. You know, we're arguing whether it's 850 or 800 parts per million or 600 parts per million, when there's all these systems out there that are terrible.
Great point, Peter, and thanks, Joey. There's a comment in the chat box. Families build CO boxes to donate to local schools here in Calgary, and the schools have not been allowed to use them. I made a CO box for my son's school, and the principal took it and put it in, but I think it was an exception. We kind of hear these stories a lot. I don't know if there's anything that we can do about it, Joey, apart from doing advocacy and lobbying. But did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can tell you as part of the committee that we'll be running, that I'm running, we will be making recommendations to improve air quality in places, and one option is to use filtration, and one option with filtration is to use the Corsi-Rosenthal box. It's definitely an acceptable method. It's been used widely at this point, and it works well. So it's unfortunate. It's partially because of all the misinformation about COVID not being airborne through public health authorities. And furthermore, indoor air quality experts, occupational hygienists, engineers, the people who really have expertise in airflow and air quality in indoor spaces have not been consulted. And I could tell you the guidance is starting to get better, but there's a lot of horrible guidance with lots of misinformation. Even from the Public Health Agency of Canada, they have a ventilation page, which overall, in my opinion, is pretty poor. It's not done that well. So the wrong people have been making the wrong decisions about this. It's very unfortunate, but that's one of the things I'm trying to remedy with the group that I have, that you have official recommendations from a diverse group of experts on this matter.
Thanks, Joey. I'm not sure if that was a hand just raised or because I saw a hand come up. I don't think it was. I'm not sure. Maybe they're just waving at you. The next one is, and we're drawing to a close here. So I might just cover this last point here from Mark Jennings. No, hold on. Let's see. Just came through. There was one here. Oh, thanks, Mark and Joe, for those helpful answers to my questions about electrical load and CO boxes. We can leverage the recent visit of Kimberly Prather to the White House, and there are also fact sheets from public health authorities. California state that endorse CO boxes, ventilation and filtration. Okay, it's from Martin Franchi. Valid argument you can use to debate the noise issue could be running on loads. Joseph's point as being the most effective, and if they use a fan in the warmer weather, it's not much different. I'm not sure what that means.
I was just trying to put forth the argument. I thought Joseph mentioned that it was effective if it was on low as opposed to high. Did you not say that earlier?
No, that's not. Oh no,
On the CR
for
box.
ceiling fans. Okay, for ceiling fans with upper room UV, the evidence that they do better as you raise the speed is not there. For CR boxes, yes, as you increase the speed, you're cleaning more air, you're putting more air through the filter, so it does.
Okay, stand
However,
corrected.
CR box on medium or high has a fairly, the noise goes up. So usually you want to run it on low, and usually that's pretty tolerable. There was one other question I want to answer quickly. Someone said, do we want 100% outdoor air during COVID? So the answer is, you obviously want to try to supply as much outdoor air as possible. But if you're supplying 1,000 CFM, cubic feet per minute, at 25% outdoor air, so that's 250, or you're just supplying 250 at 100%. So you're getting the same amount of outdoor air, just one has a lot of recirculated air being mixed. So it really wouldn't make a difference. The 1,000 might be even better because it mixes the air better. So a percent outdoor air is not necessarily a good metric.
I see Tracy's got her hand up too. Go for it, Tracy.
Yes, we have had confirmation from senior levels of the Ministry of Labor that any report that respects occupational health and safety should be provided to the Joint Health and Safety Committees. And we've had some trouble trying to get those reports from school boards. Some of them might be maintenance reports, balancing reports, where, you know, as someone with a little bit of background in HVAC, what type of report or what name of a report should we be asking, since the school boards are trying to just be a little difficult in letting us access those reports?
What type of information do you want?
The air changes per hour, like just the raw data, and then we would be able to, you know, look at whether or not there were the UV or the HEPA filters and everything to augment the raw data of air changes per hour.
So to calculate air changes per hour, you need to know the volume of the rooms. You need to know how much air is being supplied to the room, and you would need to know any other measures. So if there's a HEPA filter, what speed is it being run on and how much air is it cleaning? To know how much air is actually being supplied to the rooms. I can't really speak about internally too much about my job, but in general, for some systems, you actually do measure how much air is getting in. Most systems you don't. So quite often we know how much is being supplied from the air handling unit, but lots of the stuff could happen to that air before it actually makes it to the space. It could, you know, all be dumped into one room, or there could be a disconnect in the duct. So a lot of these issues can occur. So it's not constantly measured in the space, which is why monitoring the airflow, one of the recommendations I had, is something really good to do. And then if you see nothing's there, you could ask. So to be able to do those calculations, you'll need to know what the airflow to the space is if they have it, and what the percent of outdoor air coming in from the air handling unit is. So if you know that and you know the volume of the room, you could calculate it. It's a lot of work to do though, if they have that information.
And if I can share my experience, Tracy, you know, I looked at an indoor air quality assessment the other day, and you know, I was wondering why they didn't have air changes per hour in the report. John Odick reminded me that it's really the balancing report, the air balancing report, that you should be able to tease that information out of. And then it's also really important to, I guess, involve somebody like Joey to review that and give you back that information. So that's my thinking too. Okay, so we're kind of drawn to a close. And I see that Nick talked about, you know, how can they talk about MERV 13 not being good enough. I'll talk to you about this after, Joey. But that, you know, obviously as the filter gets more effective, the MERV goes up, there's going to be more back pressure on the system as well. So it's kind of like a balancing act. But I'll share the information with you, and you too, Joey, just where I got this from. So you might want to provide some comments on that. I think we probably should draw it to a close. It's been wonderful to have everybody participate in this, and I really thank Joey Fox for sharing his thinking here. Just help us calibrate, you know, head in the same direction, align where we're going, and also for Joey trying to fill some gaps. They're really important gaps to provide strong recommendations as well. Did anybody else have any closing comments or anything they wanted to say before we wrap up?
Thanks, I guess. Nicola, you go.
Well, I think Nick, sorry, I think Nick has kind of showed himself and he wanted to say something before.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, and I've learned, Joey, I've learned a lot from your Twitter feed over the course of the pandemic, so thanks very much for that. I think just for the discussion around what Tracy was raising, you know, I think the challenge that you run into is that your employer likely doesn't know what the air change per hour is in each classroom, right? Like you know, whoever the school likely doesn't know what it is. And, you know, and we run into that a lot in healthcare, you know, because there's a requirement in the healthcare regulations that ventilation reports are submitted every 6 months, but it's, you know, the language isn't great. And so, you know, we request everything related to HVAC. But, you know, I mean, unless they're doing air balancing, you know, reports, you know, they're not going to be able to give you the information. And so, you know, often what we've had to do with, you know, and I mean, I know you've done the same in education, but at least like what I've seen is that where we've had some success with this, it's usually been through the grievance process, and you have to spend a lot of time explaining the importance of preventative maintenance, you know, to the, you know, to folks, because just the extent to which it doesn't happen at all, you know, it's really shocking, you know, and I think, you know, we only got a sense of the scope of that issue during the pandemic, you know, because of how important ventilation is. But I mean, it's, you know, it's a massive concern going forward. So I'll shut up and thank you very much for the presentation.
So I'll say this, but thank you for that. To know what the air changes per hour from ventilation is from outdoor air. So there are two ways to do it. Either you need to know what % of outdoor air is being supplied and measure the amount of air actually entering the room. So there are devices that you could calculate exactly how much air is entering the room. And if you know what % of that is outdoor air, you could calculate from that. The other thing you could do is by monitoring CO2, you could calculate it directly, what the air changes per hour is from outdoor air, if you know the CO2 levels and you know the type of space. So I'll say this again, the calculator we're working on will have that information. So if you can monitor the CO2 inside a classroom, you could predict how well the ventilation is working.
Thanks, Joey. Val, you were going to close that video?
Yeah, well, I actually threw in the chat the link to the ventilation calculator, because in that, in I think one of the videos John did in one of the back pages of the Excel document, he's got 9 different ways to try and estimate the airflow into your room, including holding a bag over the over the diffuser and timing how long it takes to fill the bag. He and another OCCOW hygienist have developed quite a system for doing that in our own clinic, because and we had a balancing report, so they were able to compare then what they did with their giant bag and the stopwatch, and it was actually quite close. So, but there's some other ways, which includes the CO2 decay and that kind of thing, which isn't the same. Like there's a difference between the flow rate and how much of that is outside air. I appreciate. So I didn't interrupt to say that. I wanted to say thanks to you, Kevin, and to Joey for the conversation today, and to remind everybody that yes, we're trying to turn this into a series, and we do have another one booked on October 14th, which would be Dr. Roy McKay talking about his experiences with fit testing. He is the expert in North America on fit testing and has many really interesting stories to tell about challenges and also successes, and how important it is, and that kind of thing. And Krista Thompson, another OCCOW hygienist, is going to be the host that day. And we also have Dr. Michael Klompus, who's an infection infectious disease an epidemiologist in Boston who's done real time measurements of exposures of virus between patients and staff in healthcare situations and in other places, who's a convert from droplet to airborne, and he was scheduled for the 30th, but we're moving him. So it will be coming up. So look for that, because of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we're going to move the presentation to another day, and we just haven't worked that out. So all I'm saying is thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon, and look forward to more of these conversations. And everybody who attends participates and makes the conversation richer and more informative. So thanks again, everybody, and have a healthy and safe weekend.
Thanks. Just thank you for the lack of chat. Thanks for this really helpful event. Joey Fox's Clean Air Advocacy has saved a few folks I know from catching COVID. So thanks, Joey.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody.